I want to tell you about a date that changed the world. A date that received almost no coverage. A date that historians, I believe, will one day mark as one of the most consequential moments of the 21st century, February 5th, 2026. On that day, at midnight, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START, expired. And with it, for the first time in 54 years, the world woke up to a reality in which there are zero legally binding limits on how many nuclear weapons the United States or Russia can deploy, where they can deploy them, or how quickly they can expand their arsenals. 54 years. That is how long the architecture of strategic arms control held. From SALT I in 1972, through SALT II, through START I, through the Moscow Treaty, through New START, 54 years of binding limits, inspections, data exchanges, and mutual transparency between the world's two largest nuclear powers. All of it ended on February 5th, 2026, quietly, without ceremony, without significant coverage, while most of the world was tracking the Iran war. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres issued a statement that day. He called it, in his exact words, a grave moment for international peace and security. He said we face the highest risk of nuclear weapons use in decades. I call what we have entered the verification vacuum. And by the end of this video, I want you to understand exactly why this matters. Why it is not just a technical diplomatic story, and why the Iran war, for all its drama and consequences, may not be the most dangerous thing that happened in 2026. Waterty frame. Before I show you the evidence, let me be clear about who I am and what I am doing. I am a researcher who reads primary documents. Everything I am about to tell you comes from verified, named sources. The Arms Control Association, the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institution, the Federation of American Scientists, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the official UN Secretary-General's statement of February 5th, 2026, the Arms Control Today Journal, and the official US State Department statement on the conclusion of the 2026 NPT Review Conference. I am going to give you numbers, dates, direct quotes, and institutional sources for every major claim. I am also going to give you the Steelman counterargument, the strongest case that this situation is manageable, because you deserve to hear both. And then I'm going to give you 3 falsifiable predictions. Let's begin. Let me define the framework I am working with, because the term matters. A verification vacuum is not simply the absence of a treaty. It is a specific condition in which 2 nuclear-armed adversaries have lost the mechanisms. The inspections, the data exchanges, the notification protocols, the agreed counting rules, that allow each side to know what the other side actually has. The distinction is critical. When a treaty expires, the limits expire. But the verification vacuum is about something deeper, the loss of knowledge. And the loss of knowledge between nuclear powers does not produce stability. It produces worst-case planning. Here is the mechanism. Under New START, both sides were legally required to exchange data on their strategic nuclear forces twice per year. Both sides were entitled to conduct short-notice, on-site inspections, up to 18 per year per country, to verify compliance. Both sides had agreed counting rules. Exactly how many warheads counted against the limit, which delivery systems were counted, how bombers were scored. The Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, which published one of the most comprehensive analyses of New START's expiry in January 2026, described what happened precisely. Inspections had actually stopped in spring 2023, when Russia suspended its treaty participation. Russia continued voluntarily abiding by the numerical limits. But the verification machinery that gave those limits meaning had already stopped functioning 3 years earlier. So the verification vacuum did not begin on February 5th. It began in spring 2023. What February 5th did was remove the last legal obligation to abide by any limits at all. And now the question each side must answer, every day, in every war game, in every budget cycle, in every targeting decision, is what is the other side actually doing? And without inspections, without data exchange, without verification, the answer is we do not know. We can only assume. And nuclear strategists who must assume tend to assume the worst. This is the verification vacuum. And it is not a metaphor. It is a documented operational reality as of February 5th, 2026. ACT, nobody, as reporting 5,107, 107 versus 5,059. With no inspector in sight, let me give you the raw numbers, because I think they need to be said plainly, without euphemism. The United States currently possesses approximately 5,177 nuclear warheads in its total stockpile. Of those, roughly 1,700 are deployed, meaning they are on delivery systems, ready to fire. Russia currently possesses approximately 5,459 nuclear warheads in its total stockpile. Of those, Russia was previously required to keep no more than 1,550 deployed under New START. Together, the United States and Russia possess approximately 90% of all nuclear weapons on Earth. Now here is the number that should give you pause. Under New START, The deployed limit was 1,550 warheads per side. The United States' total stockpile is 5,177. That means America has approximately 3,477 warheads in reserve, non-deployed. That could, in theory, be uploaded onto delivery systems relatively quickly. The Federation of American Scientists described this in their February 5th analysis. Both countries possess significant warhead upload capacity that would allow them to increase their deployed nuclear forces relatively quickly. The FAS warned that without an official agreement following New START's expiration, both countries will likely default to mutual distrust and worst-case thinking about how their arsenals will grow in the future. Meanwhile, U.S. Undersecretary of State Thomas DiNanno told the Conference on Disarmament on February 6th, the day after expiry, that the United States could, following the expiration of New START, increase the size and diversity of its nuclear arsenal. He noted that the United States retains non-deployed nuclear capacity that can be used to address the emerging security environment if directed by the president. That is the United States government's official statement. We can expand our arsenal if we choose to. The legal constraint that previously governed that choice no longer exists. And Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov told the Russian parliament on February 11th that Russia maintains its voluntary moratorium on exceeding former treaty limits, but only as long as the United States does not exceed the above limits. One side, breaking the informal ceiling, means both sides are free. ACTTWO. HE 1950s. WHWE Jeshti returned TO the last time there were no limits. The Vienna Center for Disarmament published a line in their January 2026 analysis that I want you to hear carefully. They wrote, "The expiration of New START marks the end of an era that began in 1969, when the United States and the Soviet Union launched the SALT I negotiations. For the first time in decades, there will be no treaty constraining the nuclear arms race. For the first time in decades." Let that sit. The last time the United States and the Soviet Union, or Russia, operated without any form of arms control treaty was the 1950s. And the 1950s was the most dangerous decade in the history of nuclear weapons. In August 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. That test detonated one of the most consequential arms races in human history. By 1953, both the United States and the Soviet Union had tested hydrogen bombs, weapons hundreds of times more powerful than what destroyed Hiroshima, and they were building them as fast as they could. At its peak in the 1960s, the United States possessed approximately 31,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union peaked at approximately 45,000. Both arsenals were far beyond any rational military requirement. They were built because each side was planning for worst-case scenarios about the other. Without inspection, without verification, without agreed data, each side assumed the other was building more, and built accordingly. The Doomsday Clock, which the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has maintained since 1947, was set to 2 minutes to midnight in 1953. After both superpowers tested hydrogen bombs, the closest it had ever been at that point. The scientists who set the clock were trying to communicate the same thing I am trying to communicate now. These conditions are not stable. SALT I in 1972 was the breakthrough that ended the unconstrained arms race. It was not a perfect treaty. It did not reduce warheads. It froze delivery systems at their existing levels. But it established something more important than limits. It established the principle of mutual transparency. Both sides agreed to show each other what they had, to count, to verify, to stop guessing. That principle, the principle that transparency between nuclear adversaries reduces the risk of catastrophic miscalculation, took 54 years to build and embed into the diplomatic architecture of the world. It expired on February 5th, 2026. We are not back in the Cold War. We are in something potentially more dangerous because we have new actors, new technologies, and new crises that the Cold War arms control architecture was never designed to accommodate. We are in the 1950s, but with more nuclear armed states, with AI-assisted targeting systems, and with a global strategic environment that is more complex by orders of magnitude than anything the SALT I negotiators faced. ACTHRE, HE China trap. Why a new treaty is structurally impossible right now. Now I want to explain why the situation is not just dangerous, but why the pathway back to arms control is structurally blocked. I call this the China trap, and it is the analytical heart of this story. President Trump's position, stated on social media on February 5th, 2026, the day New START expired, is that America should pursue a new, improved, and modernized treaty. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called for a new agreement. U.S. Undersecretary DiNanno told the Conference on Disarmament that the U.S. seeks to bring China into arms control discussions and to limit all Russian nuclear warheads, not just deployed strategic warheads, as New START did. These are, as the Brookings Institution noted in its February 2026 analysis, laudable goals. The problem is structural. China's nuclear arsenal has grown from approximately 250 warheads in 2015 to approximately 600 operational warheads today. The U.S. Department of Defense projects China will reach 1,000 warheads by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. This growth rate is faster than any other nuclear-armed state. At the NPT Review Conference in May 2026, The U.S. opening statement by Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Yao focused heavily on U.S. criticisms of Chinese nuclear buildup. China's response, delivered by Ambassador Sun Li at the NPT conference, was the clearest articulation yet of China's position. I want to give you Sun Li's exact framing, because this is the document that defines the structural impossibility. The so-called multilateral nuclear arms control and strategic stability dialogue proposed by certain country is in essence an attempt to shift its special and primary responsibilities as the country with the largest nuclear arsenal onto others. Attempts to shift the responsibility for nuclear disarmament to other countries will lead nowhere. And China's ambassador for disarmament affairs, Shen Jian, had said on February 6th, the day after New START expired, China will not take part in nuclear disarmament negotiations at this stage. He reiterated China's long-standing position. Russia and the United States have special and primary responsibilities to cut their arsenals first. Now look at the mathematics of what China is actually asking for, and you will see why this is a trap rather than merely a negotiating position. China has approximately 600 warheads. The US has 5,177. Russia has 5,459. For the US and Russia to reduce to China's level, they would each need to eliminate roughly 90% of their total nuclear arsenals. That is not a negotiating concession. That is a complete restructuring of the global nuclear balance. Neither Washington nor Moscow will agree to that as a precondition for talks. And China has no incentive to join trilateral arms control talks as long as its arsenal is 8 to 9 times smaller than its two major adversaries combined. Every warhead China adds increases its relative leverage without requiring any treaty. Time is working for China in this negotiation, which means China has every rational reason to delay. The American Friends Service Committee described this deadlock precisely. Making China a precondition risks losing current guardrails on the two largest weapons stockpiles. In other words, by demanding China join before agreeing to anything with Russia, the US ensures nothing gets agreed, and the verification vacuum deepens. Russia adds its own complicating condition. Any new treaty should also include the United Kingdom and France. That makes a five-way negotiation the floor requirement, and there has never been a successful five-way nuclear arms control treaty in the history of the world. ACT4, DHE, NPT Conference, AL Reedy failed May 22, 2026. The last fallback is gone. When New START expired, many arms control experts pointed to one remaining safety net, the NPT Review Conference. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty's 11th Review Conference, scheduled for April 27th to May 22nd, 2026 in New York. 191 state parties. The broadest multilateral nuclear treaty framework in existence. In an interview before the conference, Vietnam's Ambassador Du Hung Viet, the conference president, warned that if there was another failure, we may lose the credibility of the NPT itself. The conference ran for 25 days. And on May 22nd, 2026, it concluded without adopting a consensus final document. This is the fourth time in recent history that an NPT review conference has failed to produce a consensus outcome. 2005, failure. 2015, failure. 2022, failure. 2026, failure. The only successful outcome document in recent memory was 2010. In other words, the NPT's review mechanism has failed 4 of the last 5 times it has convened. The Arms Control Association's detailed reporting on the 2026 conference is forensic. The major fault lines: the US and China publicly attacked each other's nuclear policies during the conference. The US delegation focused on Chinese nuclear buildup. China's ambassador accused the US of trying to shift its special and primary responsibilities onto others. Russia's position was that strategic stability dialogue requires far-reaching shifts in the entire US-Russia relationship before any arms control talks can proceed. The final draft outcome document, the one that failed to reach consensus, called only for constructive dialogue on the basis of mutual respect to facilitate future arms control discussions. That was the weakest possible language. And even that could not get consensus. The US State Department's official statement on the conference failure is itself a data point worth examining. The statement says, America regrets the failure, but then pivots immediately to blaming Iran's NPT noncompliance as the reason consensus was blocked. Iran's nuclear program is a real problem. But the NPT's failure in 2026 was driven primarily by the breakdown between the P5 nuclear states, not by Iran. The US statement's framing tells you what the US wants the narrative to be. It does not tell you what actually happened. After the conference, Ireland's statement on behalf of the New Agenda Coalition, Brazil, Egypt, Mexico, New Zealand, and South Africa, said plainly, against a backdrop of elevated nuclear risks, we would have expected to see more flexibility from the nuclear weapon states. Collective, constructive, and bold leadership is required, especially from all nuclear weapon states. The NPT conference was the fallback. The fallback failed. There is now no active multilateral mechanism for nuclear arms control with any prospect of near-term progress. ACT5, 85 seconds TOM, IDNITE TO, midnight, the closest the clock has ever been in its 79-year history. On January 27, 2026, 9 days before New Start expired, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists reset the Doomsday Clock. The clock moved from 89 seconds to midnight in 2025 to 85 seconds to midnight in 2026. 85 seconds to midnight is the closest the Doomsday Clock has ever been set since its creation in 1947. It is further than the 89 seconds set in 2025. It is further than the 90 seconds set in 2023. It moves in only one direction, toward midnight. Alexandra Bell, president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, said at the announcement, "The Doomsday Clock's message cannot be clearer. Catastrophic risks are on the rise, cooperation is on the decline, and we are running out of time." The Bulletin explicitly named New Start's expiration as one of the factors driving the 2026 setting. Drive Daniel Holtz, chair of the Bulletin's Science and Security Board, said at the January press conference, "The last remaining treaty governing nuclear weapons stockpiles between the US and Russia will soon expire on February 4th. For the first time in over half a century, there will be nothing preventing a runaway nuclear arms race." Now, I want to be honest about the Doomsday Clock's limitations. The clock is a symbolic metric, not a scientific measurement. It combines nuclear risk, climate change, biological threats, and AI disruption into a single number. MIT scholar Austin Long has noted that today's security environment is night and day compared to when New Start was negotiated. But that complexity also makes the clock difficult to interpret precisely. However, I think the clock's symbolic value is precisely its usefulness here. The Bulletin was founded in 1945 by scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project. They built a nuclear weapon and spent the rest of their lives trying to communicate its danger to a public that consistently underestimates it. When they say we are at 85 seconds, the closest ever, they are making a judgment that the structural conditions for nuclear risk are worse now than they have ever been, including worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis, including worse than any moment in the Cold War. That judgment deserves to be heard ACT-SEX, HE-Q argument, and WHW IT falls SART. The case for it will be fine. I want to give you the strongest counter-argument to everything I have said, because intellectual honesty requires it. The counter-argument goes like this. New Start was already hollowed out before it expired. Russia had suspended inspections in spring 2023. The US had stopped sharing some data in response. Both sides were already operating without verification for 3 years before the treaty formally died. And during those 3 years, nothing catastrophic happened. Neither side broke the warhead limits. The arsenals did not surge. Deterrence held. The Arms Control Association acknowledged this in their coverage. While both Russia and the United States have, according to open source estimates, maintained the limits required by New Start thus far, the treaty's verification provisions have not been fully implemented for some time. And Brookings noted that despite the expiry, reports that the two superpowers have agreed to keep talking and to develop a follow-on agreement bring optimism. Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov confirmed on February 11th that Russia maintains its voluntary moratorium. Trump posted on February 5th that he wants a new treaty. Both sides are talking. Some form of informal understanding may emerge. This is the strongest form of the counterargument. Deterrence works. Both sides understand that nuclear use is catastrophic. Both sides have strategic incentives to avoid an arms race they cannot afford. The informal norms that kept arsenals roughly stable between 2023 and 2026, despite no verification, may continue to hold. I take this argument seriously. Deterrence has worked for 80 years. The logic of mutual assured destruction is grimly robust. It has survived crises that should, in theory, have produced nuclear use. Cuba 1962, the 1983 Able Archer NATO exercise, the Stanislav Petrov false alarm of 1983. But here is why I think the counterargument falls short. Deterrence works when each side can accurately assess the other's capabilities. The verification vacuum does not eliminate deterrence. It degrades the quality of information on which deterrence decisions are made. It increases the probability of miscalculation. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably. And in a domain where a 1% increase in the probability of miscalculation involves nuclear weapons, even marginal increases in risk are worth treating as serious. The FAS put it correctly. In the absence of an agreement, both countries will likely default to mutual distrust and worst-case thinking. Worst-case planning drives arsenal expansion. Arsenal expansion drives the other side's worst-case planning. This is an arms race, not necessarily in warhead numbers, but in targeting, in delivery systems, in AI-integrated launch decision architecture. And there is no treaty to slow any of it down. Prediction 1. The NPT failure was already confirmed. Now watch the fallout. This prediction is already partially confirmed, which is unusual for a prediction section. I told you in the original topic setup that the NPT Review Conference would be the first signal of multilateral breakdown. The 2026 NPT Review Conference, which ran from April 27th to May 22nd, concluded without a consensus final document. Its fourth failure in 5 cycles. The prediction that follows from this confirmed failure. The NPT credibility crisis will accelerate a new wave of nuclear proliferation anxiety in the next 24 months. Watch specifically for states that currently rely on extended nuclear deterrence, U.S. nuclear guarantees, to reassess their security calculations. Japan, South Korea, and Germany are the three I am watching most closely. Any public statement by an elected official in those countries calling for their own nuclear deterrent will be the signal that the post-NPT proliferation cascade has begun. Prediction 2. Russia formally declares its arsenal no longer, subject to former treaty limits, before 2027. As of July 2026, Russia maintains a voluntary moratorium, Lavrov's February statement, but conditions it explicitly on U.S. behavior. My prediction, before February 5th, 2027, the one-year mark after expiry. Russia will formally declare that it no longer considers itself bound by any limit derived from New START, and will announce at least one new nuclear delivery system not previously constrained by treaty. This is falsifiable. Watch for official Russian government statements and for ICBM or SLBM test announcements from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Russia's DF equivalent, the RS-28 Sarmat, and its novel Poseidon undersea nuclear drone were both excluded from or incompletely addressed by New START's counting rules. Expect Russia to accelerate both. Prediction 3. No successor treaty framework is even agreed in principle before the end of 2027. Trump wants a new treaty. Russia wants a complete reset of the U.S.-Russia relationship as a precondition. China refuses trilateral talks unless the U.S. and Russia reduce to near Chinese levels first. Russia also demands UK and France join any new framework. These four positions are structurally irreconcilable on any timescale shorter than a decade. My prediction? No agreed framework for a successor treaty. Not a signed treaty, not a draft text, not even agreed terms of reference for negotiations. Will exist by December 31st, 2027. Both sides will continue informal moratoriums, continue talking, and continue expanding their arsenal's qualitative capabilities. The verification vacuum will be the permanent condition for at least the next 5 years. These are falsifiable. I will return to check them. I want to end with a thought that I have been sitting with while researching this video. The arms control architecture that expired on February 5th, 2026 was not built in one treaty. It was built across 54 years of sustained diplomatic effort, beginning in 1969 when Henry Kissinger and his Soviet counterparts sat down to negotiate SALT-I. It was built by people who had lived through Hiroshima, through the Cuban Missile Crisis, through the terrifying years of the 1950s when both superpowers were adding warheads faster than anyone could count. They understood, from lived experience, what an unconstrained nuclear arms race looked like, and they built the architecture specifically to prevent it from happening again. That architecture did not prevent all conflict. It did not resolve all disagreements. It did not make the US and Russia friends, but it established a floor of transparency, a minimum shared knowledge of each other's capabilities that allowed both sides to make deterrence decisions with enough information to avoid catastrophic miscalculation. That floor is now gone. The people who built SALT-I in 1972 are dead. The institutional memory of what it took to construct that architecture, the years of technical negotiations, the verification protocols, the counting rules, the inspection rights, exists in documents and in the memories of a diminishing group of arms control veterans. The political will to rebuild it requires leadership that is willing to invest years in slow, unglamorous, technically demanding diplomatic work at a moment when political attention spans are measured in news cycles. I am not pessimistic by temperament. I am a researcher who tries to read evidence honestly. And the evidence, as of July 2026, suggests that the conditions for rebuilding arms control are worse than they have been at any point since 1969. So here's the question I want to leave you with. It is not rhetorical. I genuinely do not know the answer. Is the verification vacuum a temporary condition, a gap between two eras of arms control that will eventually be filled by a new treaty architecture suited to the three-power nuclear world of the 21st century? Or is it the permanent condition of great power competition from this point forward? A world in which nuclear deterrence runs on mutual fear rather than mutual knowledge? The answer matters. Because if it is the former, then the risk is manageable and patience is the right response. And if it is the latter, then the doomsday clock at 85 seconds is not a warning. It is a description. Think about that. The next video in this series looks at the India-Pakistan nuclear standoff of 2025, the first time two nuclear-armed states exchanged military strikes in the 21st century. The world forgot about it in 96 hours. That should terrify you. Click here to watch.